This is Cynthia's Chauffeur by Louis Tracy, a work in the public domain. Chapter 13. Wherein wrath beguiles good judgment. Good morning, George. Good morning, Dad. Enjoy your run to Hereford? Immensely. Did you? It was not so bad. Rather tiresome, you know, travelling alone, but on the return journey I fell in with a decent sort of Frenchman who helped to pass the time. Monsieur Marigny, in fact. Ah, you know him, of course. I had forgotten. I have met him. He is not the kind of person I care to know. The Earl selected an egg, tapped it, and asked his son what he thought of the crops. Did they want rain? The two were breakfasting alone. At the moment there was not even a manservant in the room, but Lord Fairholme had long ago established the golden rule that controversial topics were taboo during meals. Meddenham laughed outright at the sudden change of topic. He remembered that Dale was sent to bed in the Green Dragon Hotel at 8 o'clock, and he had not the least doubt that his father's ukase was really a dodge to secure an undisturbed dinner. But he was under no delusions because of this placid meeting in the breakfast room. There was thunder in the air. Tomkinson had warned him of it overnight. "There's been ructions while you were away, my lord," the butler had whispered, waylaying him in the hall just before midnight. "Lady St. Maur has upset the Earl something dreadful," and Meddenham had growled in reply. "Her ladyship will lunch here at 1 o'clock tomorrow, Tomkinson. Have an ambulance ready at 2, for she will be in little pieces before I have done with her. The mangling will be something awful." "But what has become of Dale, my lord?" went on Tomkinson in a hushed voice. "Dale? He is all right. Why? Is he in the soup too?" "No, my lord. I've heard nothing of that, but he sent me a wire from Bristol." "A telegram. About what?" "About a horse." "Oh, the deuce take you and your horses. By the way, that reminds me, you gave me a rotten tip for the Derby." "It was a false run race, my lord. The favourite was swept off his feet at Tattenham Corner and couldn't get into his stride again till the field was opposite Langland Stands. After that, I'm going to bed. But I forgive you, Tomkinson. You put up a ripping good lunch. You're a far better butler than a tipster." This brief conversation had illumined at least one dubious page in the records of the past few days. Meddenham realised now that his aunt had emptied the vials of her wrath on Mrs. Devar, but, that lady being absent in body, the Earl had received the full dose. It indicated somewhat the line he should follow when, breakfast ended, his father suggested that they should smoke a cigarette in the library. Once there, and the door closed, the Earl established himself on the hearthrug with his back to the fireplace. It was high summer, and the lazy London heat crept in through the open windows, but the hearthrug constituted a throne, a seat of Solomon. Had his lordship stood anywhere else he would have felt lacking in authority. "Now, George, my boy, tell me all about it," he said, with a genially paternal air that lent itself admirably to the discussion of a youngster's transgressions. Meddenham had a sense of humour denied to his well-meaning sire. He recalled the last time he had heard those words. He and another sprig of nobility had come up to London from Winchester without leave in order to attend a famous glove contest between heavyweights, and there had been wigs on the green before an irate headmaster would even deign to flog them. That had happened 12 years ago, almost to a day. Since then he had fought through a great war, had circled the globe, had sought the wild places of earth and its monsters in their lairs. He knew men and matters as his father had never known them. A prime minister had urged him to adopt a political career, and had virtually promised him a colonial under-secretaryship as soon as he entered Parliament. He held the DSO, had been thanked by the Royal Geographical Society for a paper on Kilimanjaro, and cordially invited by the Foreign Office to send in any further notes in his possession. Months later, he heard that Sir Somebody Something was deeply interested in his comments on the activity of a certain great power in the neighbourhood of Britain's chief coaling stations in the Indian Ocean. The absurdity of a family conclave in which he should again be treated as a small boy, and admonished to apologise and be flogged, while it brought a smile to his lips, banished any notion of angry remonstrance. "By all about it, I suppose you mean that you wish to hear what I have been doing since last Wednesday," he said pleasantly. "Well, Dad, I have obeyed your orders. You asked me to find a wife worthy to reign at Fairholme. I have succeeded." "You don't mean to say you have married her," shouted the Earl, in a purple upheaval of rage whose lightning-like abruptness was not its least amazing feature. Certainly Meddenham was taken aback by it. Indeed, he was almost alarmed, though he had no knowledge of apoplexy in the family. "I have not even asked the lady yet," he said quietly. "I think, that the idea will not be disagreeable to her, But a future Countess of Fairholme is not to be carried by storm in that fashion. We must get to know her people." "D.N. her people," broke in the older man. "Have you taken leave of your wits, George, to stand there and talk such infernal nonsense? Steady, Dad, steady." And the quiet voice grew still more calm, though the forehead wrinkled a little, and there was an ominous tightening of the lips. "You must take that back. Pater Van Reenen is quite as great a man in the United States as you are in England, may I even say without disrespect, a man who has won a more commanding position. And his daughter, Cynthia, is better fitted to adorn a coronet than a great many women now entitled to wear one." The Earl laughed, with an immoderate display of an amusement he was far from feeling. "Are these Wiggy Diva's credentials? By gad, that shabby little wretch is flying high when she tries to bag my son for her pretty protégée. Don't you think it would be wiser, sir, if you allowed me to tell you exactly what has taken place since we met last? What good purpose will that serve? I have heard the whole story from Lady Porthcawl, from Dale, from that Frenchman, and heaven knows I have been well coached in Mrs. Diva's antecedents by your Aunt Susan. George, I am surprised that a man of your sound common sense should permit yourself to be humbugged so egregiously. Yes, I am aware that an accident led you to take Simmons's place in the first instance, but can't you see that the Devar creature must have gone instantly on her bended knees, if she ever does pray, which I doubt, and thanked Providence for the chance that enabled her to dispose of an earldom? At a pretty stiff price too, I'll be bound, if the truth were told. Really, George, notwithstanding your very extensive travels and wide experiences, you are nothing but a kid in the hands of a managing woman of the Devar variety. I am not being given in marriage by Mrs. Devar, I assure you," began Meddenham, smiling anxiously, for the fatherly "tell me all about it" was not being borne out by the Earl's petulance. "No, you can trust me to take care of that. But are you treating me quite fairly? Why should the distorted version of my affairs given by Lady Porthcawl, a woman whom Cynthia Van Reenen could not possibly receive in her house, and by Count Edward Marini, a disappointed fortune-hunter, be accepted without cavil, while my own story is not listened to? I leave Dale out of it. I am sure he told you the actual truth. By the way, where is he now? Somewhere in the neighbourhood of Chester, I believe. Have you discharged him? No. Why should I? Because I wish it. Why in the world are you so unreasonable, Dad? Unreasonable. By gad, I like that. Have I been gallivanting round the country with some— Stop. You are going too far. This conversation must cease here and now. If you have any respect for yourself, though not for me, you must adjourn the discussion till after you have met Miss Van Reenen and her father." For the first time in his life, the Earl of Fairholme realized his limitations. He was actually cowed for a few fleeting seconds. But the arrogant training of the county bench, the seigneury of a vast estate, the unquestioning deference accorded to his views by thousands of men who tacitly admitted that what he said must be right because he was a lord. These excellent stays of self-conceit came to his help, and he snorted indignantly. "I absolutely refuse to meet either of them." "That disposes of the whole difficulty for the hour," said Meddenham, turning to leave the room. "Wait, George, I insist." Perhaps a clearer glimpse of a new and, to him, utterly unsuspected force in his son's character withheld the imperious command that trembled on the Earl's lips. Meddenham halted. The two looked at each other, and the older man fidgeted with his collar, which seemed to have grown tight for his neck. Come, let us not leave a friendly argument in this unsettled state," he said after an awkward pause. "My only thought is for your interests, you know. Your lifelong happiness is at stake, to say nothing of the future of our house. I recognize those considerations so fully that I am going now in order to shirk even the semblance of a quarrel between us. Why not thresh things out? Your aunt will be here in a couple of hours. You refuse to hear a word. You argue with a hammer, sir. I shall send a note to Lady Maur, telling her that she has done mischief in plenty without adding fuel to the fire by coming here today, unless you wish to consult her, that is." The Earl, already afraid of his sister, was rapidly learning to fear his son. "Dash it all, don't tell me you are off on this D.D. motoring trip once more," he cried passionately. Meddenham smiled, even in his anger. "See how wilfully you misunderstand me," he said. "I came away from Miss Van Reenen solely because matters had gone far enough under rather absurd conditions. She knows me only as Fitzroy, the chauffeur. It is time to drop masquerading. Romance is delightful in its way. Perhaps there might well be more of it in this commonplace world of ours. But none of us can afford to play the knight-errant too long, so when next I meet Cynthia, It will be as a man who occupies a social position that renders our marriage at least possible." Lord Fairholme threw out his hands in a gesture of sheer bewilderment. "And do you honestly believe that?" he exclaimed. "I am quite sure of it. I may have to jump a very big fence indeed when she learns the harmless deception I have practiced on her, but I do hope most devoutly that she will look at the facts more calmly than you have done." The Earl took a turn or two on the hearthrug, from which wisdom had temporarily taken flight. He thought now he could see a way to avoid open rupture, and he believed, quite rightly, that his son was in no mood to accept further disillusionment. "At any rate," he grumbled, "you are cutting a discred. Sorry, I didn't quite mean that. You are not rushing away from town again in pursuit of the young lady?" "No. When is she due back in London?" "On Sunday." "And you will not see her before that day?" "I believe not. In fact, I am fairly certain of it. Mrs. Leland joined her at Chester last night, so there should be no curtailment of the tour." The Earl started. "Mrs. Leland, not the Mrs. Leland of Paris and San Remo?" "Yes. By hazard, as it were, you have let me tell you why I came away. One of the reasons. Mrs. Leland would have recognized me at once." Dear me, this is a beastly muddle. Look here, George, promise me you won't do anything stupid for a day or so." "I have been so pestered by people, I don't know which way to turn. Why not stay and meet your aunt?" "Because I might lose my temper with her." "Ah, well, she is somewhat trying when it comes to family matters. Still, I may tell her that she ought to mind her own business, by all means. And oblige me, too, by telling her that she would confer a boon on humanity if she persuaded Lady Porthcawl to go to Jericho or Tokyo or wherever that ass, Porthcawl, may happen to be. Millicent Porthcawl was at Bournemouth, you know." "Yes, I spoke to her. She had the impudence to introduce Ducrot to Cynthia." "By gad." "Did she, though? I heard something from Scarland about that affair." Well, there's no accounting for tastes. I suppose you realise, George, that I am keeping back a good deal of the tittle-tattle which reached me during your absence. I don't want to hurt your feelings." "Thank you. The absurdity of the present position lies in the fact that I shall have all my work cut out to hold your wrath against these people within bounds when once you have met Cynthia." "Oh, I have no doubt she is pretty and fascinating and all that sort of thing," growled the Earl, in a grudging access of good humour. "Confound it, that is why we are putty in their hands, George. Don't forget, I've had 55 years of 'em. Gad, I could tell you things. All right, let us chuck the dispute for the time. Shall I see you at dinner?" "Yes, if you are alone." "There will be no women. I'll take devilish good care of that. Scarland is in town for the show, and he is bringing Sir Ashley Stoke, but Betty is nursing a youngster through the measles. Good Lord, I'm glad your aunt didn't get hold of Betty." Now, Lord Fairholme's diatribes against the sex were not quite justified. Notorious as a lady-killer in his youth, in middle age he was as garrulous a gossip as Mrs. Devar herself. Indeed, he had an uneasy consciousness that Lady Sir Maur might turn and rend him if stress were laid only on her efforts to thwart his son's unexpected leaning towards matrimony. During every yard of the journey from Chester to London, he had tried to extract information from Marigny, and the sharp-witted Frenchman had enjoyed himself hugely in displaying a well-feigned reluctance to yield to the Earl's probing. It was just as much a part of his scheme to make the threatened alliance as objectionable on the one side as on the other. By painting Meddenham as an unprincipled adventurer, he had succeeded in alarming Van Reenen. His sly hints, derogatory of both Cynthia and her father, now fanned the flame of suspicion kindled in Lord Fairholme's breast by his sister's remonstrances. Unfortunately, his lordship had gone straight to Curzon Street and told Susan St. Maur every word that Marigny had said, and a good deal that he had not said, but had left to be inferred from a smirk, a malicious glance, an airy gesture. Perhaps the two elderly guardians of the Fairholme line were not wholly to blame for their interference. The title descended through male heirs only, and Meddenham's marriage thereby attained an added importance. Lord Fairholme himself had been singularly fortunate in escaping a mésalliance, several in fact, and it was the one great trouble in his otherwise smooth and self-contained life that his high-born and most admirable countess had died soon after the birth of her second child, the present Marchioness of Scarland. Such a man would naturally be the most jealous scrutineer of the pretensions of his son's chosen wife. Qualities of heart and mind would weigh light in the scale against genealogy. To his thinking, blue blood differed from the common red stream as the claret of some noted vintage differs from the vin ordinaire of the same year. Perhaps he had blundered on a well-founded theory, but he certainly lacked discrimination as to the crew. Meddenham did some shopping, lunched at a club, surprised his tailor by a prolonged visit and close inspection of tweeds and broadcloths, and successfully repressed a strong desire to write a letter. It was some consolation to peruse for the 20th time the 4 closely written pages on which Cynthia had set out the tour's timetable for the benefit of Simmons. He had not returned it since she possessed a copy, and in his mind's eye he followed the Mercury in its flight up the map from end to end of industrial Lancashire, through smoky Preston to trim Lancaster and quiet Kendal, and finally, after a long day, to the brooding peace and serene beauty of Windermere. At last, rousing himself from his dreaming, for he was now back in his club again, sipping a cup of tea, he glanced at his watch. 5 o'clock. A likely hour to find Mr. Van Reenen in the hotel, if, as was most probable, Diva's telegram to his mother was altogether mistaken in its report of the millionaire's movements. He meant, of course, to make himself known to Van Reenen and go through the whole adventure from A to Z. It should provide an interesting story, he thought, lively as a novel in some of its chapters, and calculated to appeal strongly to the bright intelligence of an American. On his way to the Savoy, he tried to picture to himself just what Cynthia's father would look like. It was a futile endeavour, because he had never yet been able to construct a mental portrait of any man wholly unknown to him. One day in Madras, he had telephoned to an official for leave to shoot an elephant in a government reservation, and a deep voice boomed back an answer. Apparently, it belonged to a man whose stature warranted his appointment as controller of monsters, but when Meddenham called in person for the permit, he found that the voice came from a lean and wizened scrap of humanity about 5 feet high. He smiled at the recollection of his dumb surprise at this apparition, and was in the best of humours with himself when he arrived at the inquiry office of the Savoy Hotel and asked for Mr. Peter Van Reenen. "Left here Sunday, sir," was the answer. "He will not return for a week." This blow dished his hopes. He had counted strongly on gaining Van Reenen's friendship and sympathy before Cynthia's dainty vision met his eyes again. "Has he gone to Paris?" he inquired. "Can't say, sir, I'm sure. My orders are to tell callers that Mr. Van Reenen will be in town next Tuesday." So, if present arrangements held good, Cynthia would reach London 2 days before her father. Well, he must contrive somehow to get Lady Maur in a proper frame of mind. Mrs. Leland's presence would be a positive blessing in that respect. Meanwhile, there would be no harm done if he, lest prudence should conquer him a second time, he sat down and wrote, "Dear Mrs. Van Reenen, I hope the car is behaving in a manner that befits the messenger of the gods, and that Dale has justified my faith in him. I am here in fulfilment of my promise to call on Mr. Van Reenen. Unluckily, he is out of town, and the hotel people say he is not expected back till a day early next week. If you make any change in your programme, or even if you have a minute to spare, though proving yourself a true American by rigidly adhering to schedule, please send a line to yours ever sincerely." Once more he hesitated at the name, and contented himself by signing George, the chauffeur. The problem of an address offered some difficulty, but he boldly declared for 91 Grosvenor Square in a postscript, believing, and correctly as it happened, that Cynthia shared with Sam Weller a peculiar knowledge of London that rendered one address very like unto another in her eyes. The failure to meet Van Reenen was the first real drawback he had encountered. It was irritating at the time, but he gave little heed to it after the first pang of disappointment had passed. Fate, which had proved so kind during 6 days, did not see fit to warn him that her smiles would now be replaced by frowns. She even lulled him into the belief that Van Reenen's absence might prove fortunate. Perhaps, he fancied, I would have rubbed him up the wrong way. He is devoted to his daughter, and he might look on my harmless but unavoidable guile with a prejudiced eye. In any event, I should be compelled to go slow in analysing Mrs. Duval's motives, and this pertinacious Marigny seems to have been fairly intimate with him in Paris. Yes, on the whole, it is just as well that I missed him. Cynthia can put matters before him in a better light than is possible to one who is an utter stranger. I must tell her, in my best American, that it is up to her to explain Fitzroy to Pap. Before leaving the hotel he inquired for Count Edouard Marigny. He drew a blank there. No such name had been registered during the year. The dinner passed without noteworthy incident. Sir Ashley Stoke condemned the government. The Marquis of Scarland was more than sceptical as to the prospects of grouse shooting after the deluge in April and May. Lord Fairholme growled at the pernicious effects of the Ground Game Act, and Meddenham spoke of these things with his lips, but in his heart thought of Cynthia. The 4 men were in the smoking room, and the Earl was chaffing his son on account of his inability to play bridge when Tomkinson entered. He approached Meddenham. "Dale has arrived. He wishes to see your lordship," he said in a stage whisper. "Dale!" The young man sprang to his feet, and his troubled cry brought a smile of wonderment to his brother-in-law's face. "By Jove," said the Marquis, "you couldn't have jumped quicker if Tomkinson had said the devil instead of Dale. Who then is Dale?" Meddenham hurried from the room without another word. The Earl shook his head. "More mischief," he muttered. "Dale is George's chauffeur. I suppose he is mixed up in this Van Reenen muddle again." "What muddle is that?" asked Scarland. "Is George in it? That would be unusual." Fairholme suddenly bethought himself. "Something to do with a motor," he said vaguely. "The Van Reenens are Americans, friends of Mrs. Leland's. You remember her, Arthur, don't you?" "Perfectly." "Is Van Reenen the Peter of that ilk?" "I think so. Yes, that is the name. Peter Van Reenen." "Oh, he's all right. If George has any dispute with him, I'll settle it in a minute. He is as straight as they make 'em. Bought 2 of my prize bulls 3 years ago for his ranch in Montana. By the way, someone told me the other day that he has a very pretty daughter. A real peach, the man said. Wonder if George has seen her. Begad, he might go farther and fare worse. We effete aristocrats can do with a strain of new blood occasionally, eh? What?" "Van Reenen sounds like a blend of old Dutch and New England," said Sir Ashley Stoke, who was sane on all subjects save one, his pet mania being the decay of England since the passing of the Victorian age. The Earl helped himself to a whisky and soda. His egotism was severely shaken. Who would have thought that a pillar of the state like Scarland would approve of this Van Reenen girl as a match for George, even in jest? But he had the good sense to steer clear of explanations. When he found his voice, it was to swear at the quality of the whisky. Meddenham, meanwhile, had rushed into the hall. He expected to find Dale there, but saw no one except the suave footman on duty. The man opened the door. "Dale is outside in the car, my lord," he said. "In the car." That meant the bursting of a meteor in a blue sky. Sure enough, there stood the Mercury, dusty and panting, but seemingly gathering breath for another mighty effort if necessary. "Come in," shouted Meddenham, on whom the first strong shadow of impending disaster had fallen as soon as he heard those ill-omened words, "in the car." Dale scrambled to the pavement and walked stiffly up the steps, being weary after an almost unbroken run of 180 miles. He nodded to the Mercury, and the footman rang for a page boy to mount guard. Meddenham led the way into a small anteroom and switched on the light. "Now," he said. "Mr. Van Reenen came to Chester last night in Simmons' car, my lord. This morning he sent for me and says, 'Who are you?' 'The chauffeur, sir,' says I. 'Whose chauffeur?' says he. 'Yours for the time,' says I, being sort of ready for him. 'Well, you can get,' says he. 'Get what?' says I. 'Get out,' says he. Of course, my lord, I knew well enough what he meant, but I wanted to have it straight, and I got it." Dale's style of speech was elliptical, though he might have been surprised if told so. For once, Meddenham wished he was a loquacious man. "Was nothing else said?" he asked. "No message from anyone? No reason given? What brought Simmons to Chester? Mr. Van Reenen picked him up in Bristol at 4 a.m. yesterday, my lord." Simmons made out that there Frenchman, Monsieur Marini, Dale prided himself on a smattering of French, had pitched a fine old tale about you. In fact, the bearings got so hot at Simmons' yacht that Simmons chucked his job till Mr. Van Reenen sort of apologised. "Can you be specific, Dale? You are hard to follow." "Well, my lord, I could do with a drink. It's a long road that stretches between here and Chester, and I left there at 10 o'clock this morning, running through any Gord's quantity of traps and all." Meddenham did not smile. He touched a bell and found that Dale's specific was a bottle of beer. "I never set eyes on Miss Cynthia," continued the chauffeur, his wits quickening under the soothing draught. "Another lady came out and looked me up and down. 'Yes, that is the car,' she said, and with that I remembered seeing her at San Remo. Mrs. Devar seemed as if she wanted to say somethink, but she daren't, because Mr. Van Reenen's eye was on her. He made no bones about it, but told me to hike back to London the minute Simmons got the carrier off. I am quite clear on that point. What I really want to know is the reason behind Simmons's statement about Count Marini's tail pitching, as you term it. Oh, of course, Mr. Van Reenen didn't say anything. Simmons was what you call putting 2 and 2 together. From what Mr. Van Reenen asked him, it was easy enough to get at the Frenchman's dirty tricks." "Tell me how Simmons put it," said Meddenham, with the patience of a great anger. Dale scratched the back of his ear. For one thing, my lord, Mr. Van Reenen wanted to know if you was really a viscount. It was a long time before Simmons could get him to believe that the accident in Down Street wasn't a put-up job. Then he was sure you stopped in Simmons' yacht just in order to throw Mr. Marini off your track. Simmons is no fool, my lord, and he guesses that the Frenchman brought Mr. Van Reenen hot foot from Paris so as to... Dale grinned and sought inspiration in the bottom of an empty glass. Well, my lord, excuse me, he said, but you know what I mean. Meddenham completed the sentence. So as to prevent me from marrying Miss Cynthia. Exactly what Simmons and me said, my lord. He will not succeed, Dale. I never thought he would. Once your lordship is set on a thing, well, that thing occurs. Thank you, good night. Meddenham did not feel equal to facing the men in the smoking room again. He went out, walked up Oxford Street and across the park, and reached his room about midnight. Next day he devoted himself to work. In view of the new and strange circumstances that had arisen, he believed confidently that Cynthia would reply to his letter by return of post, and there should be no chance of delay, because she meant to stay 2 days at Windermere, making that town the centre of excursions through Lakeland. While the son was seeking forgetfulness in classifying a collection of moths and night-flies caught during a week at La Turbie, the father found occupation in prosecuting diligent inquiries into the social and financial standing of Peter Van Reenen. As a result, the Earl visited Lady Maur, and, as a further result, Lady Maur wrote a very biting and sarcastic note to my dear Millicent. Moreover, she decided not to press her nephew to visit her at present. Next morning, Meddenham was up betimes. He heard the early postman's knock, and Tomkinson in person brought the letters. "There's nothing in the name of Fitzroy, my lord," said he, having been warned in that matter overnight. Meddenham took his packet with the best grace possible, trying to assure himself that Cynthia had written at a late hour and had missed the first London mail in consequence. Glancing hurriedly through the correspondence, however, his glance fell on a letter bearing the Windermere postmark. It was addressed in an unfamiliar hand to Viscount Middenham, and the writing was bold, well-formed, and businesslike. Then he read, "Sir, my daughter received a note from you this morning, and she was about to answer it when I informed her that she was communicating with a person who had given her an assumed name. I also asked her, as a favour, to permit me to reply in her stead. Now, I have this to say, Miss Van Reenen does not know, and will never know from me, the true nature of the trick you played on her. You bear the label of a gentleman, so it is my earnest hope, indeed my sincere belief, that you will respect the trust she placed in you, and not expose her to the idle chatter of clubs and scandal-spreading drawing-rooms. During 2 days I have been very bitter against you. Today I take a calmer view, and, provided that neither my daughter nor I ever see or hear of you again, I shall be willing to credit that you acted more in a spirit of youthful caprice than from any foul desire to injure the good repute of one who has done no harm to you or yours. I am, yours truly, Peter Van Reenen." Meddenham read and reread this harsh letter many times. Then, out of brooding chaos, leaped one fiery question. Where was Marini? The gate which Cynthia's father had shut and bolted in his face did not frighten him. He had leaped a wall of brass and triple steel when he won Cynthia Van Reenen's love in the guise of an humble chauffeur, so it was unbelievable that the barrier interposed by a father's misguided wrath should prove unsurmountable. But Marini, he wanted to feel his fingers clutching that slender throat, to see that pink and white face empurple and grow black under their strain, and it was all important that the scoundrel should be brought to book before the Van Reenens returned to London. He gave a passing thought to Mrs. Leland, it was true. If she shared with Van Reenen the silly little secret of his identity, it was beyond comprehension that she should let her friend hold the view that he, Meddenham, was merely an enterprising blackguard. Still, these considerations were light as thistledown compared with the need of finding Marini. He and Dale began to hunt London for the Frenchman, but they had to deal with a wary bird who would not break covert till it suited his own convenience. And then the sublime cheek of the man. On the Friday morning, when Meddenham rose with a fixed resolve to obtain the services of a private detective, he received this note. "Dear Viscount Meddenham, I have a notion. As our mutual acquaintance Mr. Van Reenen would say, do you know him? Now that I consider the matter, I think not. That you are anxious to meet me. We have things to discuss, have we not? Well, then I await you at the above address. Yours to command, Edouard Marinier." Chapter 14. A.N.D. Good judgment yields T.O. folly. At any other moment, the tone of confidence underlying the effrontery of this letter would certainly have revealed its presence to a brain more than ordinarily acute. But in the storm and stress of his rage against gods and men, Meddenham did not wait to ponder subtleties of expression. No matter what the hidden reason that inspired Marini's pen, it was enough for Meddenham to know that at last that arch-plotter and very perfect rascal was within his reach. He breakfasted in a fury of haste, crammed on a hat, and rushed away, meaning to drive in a cab to the hotel in Northumberland Avenue from which Marini wrote. Such was his agitated state that he was not even surprised when he found the Mercury waiting outside, with Dale, taciturn as ever, scrutinizing the day's sporting news. In sober fact, the man was almost as perturbed as his master. For an hour in the morning, and again during certain periods of suspense in the afternoon, he forgot his troubles in the effort either to spot winners or to persuade himself that the horses he had selected for particular races had not run since their names failed to appear among the first three. But these spasms of anticipation and disillusionment soon passed. During the remainder of the long hours of daylight, Dale was ever on the qui-vive for a wild rush of 200 or 300 miles in pursuit of the woman whose charms had so effectually subjugated the young Viscount. Even the hunt for Marini did not weaken Dale's belief, and Meddenham was never in Cavendish Square or at his club at any practicable hour that the Mercury was not at hand, with petrol tanks full, luggage carriers attached, and a full stock of spares and reserve spirit on board. At any rate, on this occasion Meddenham merely gave him Marini's address and jumped inside. Dale was disappointed. He expected the order to be Carlisle at the least. Soon his lordship was being conducted by an hotel servant to a private sitting-room. The Frenchman, who was seated at a table, writing when he entered, rose and bowed politely. "I thought it highly probable that I should have the honour of seeing you this morning, Viscount Meddenham," he said, and there was a touch of restraint, of formal courtesy, in his voice that the other, even in his anger against the man, did not fail to notice. Oddly enough, it savoured of brutality to attack him without preface, and Marini seemed to be unconscious of his visitor's unconcealed animosity. "I am glad you are here," he went on glibly. "Recent events call for a full discussion between you and me, do you agree? But before we come to close quarters, as you say in England, I wish to know whether the argument is to be conducted on lines that befit gentlemen. On the last occasion when we differed, you used the methods of the costermonger." "They served their purpose," said Meddenham, annoyed at finding the Frenchman's coolness rather disconcerting. Suddenly, he decided on a new plan of action, and resolved to let the man say what he chose. Dearly as he would have liked to wreak physical vengeance on him, he felt that such a proceeding offered the least satisfactory way out of a situation fraught with no small risk of publicity. Marini must have had some all-powerful motive in sending for him, better learn that before his bitter and contemptuous words sealed an adversary's lips. "Won't you sit down?" came the urbane request. "I prefer standing, if you don't mind," said Meddenham curtly. Then he added, after a little pause, "It may clear the atmosphere somewhat if I tell you that I threatened you at Bristol merely because a certain issue had to be determined within a few seconds. That consideration does not apply now. You are at liberty to say what you like without fear of consequences." The Frenchman elevated his eyebrows. "Fear?" he said. "Oh, don't bandy words with me. You know what I mean. I suppose a man must possess courage of a sort even to become a blackmailer, which is what you threaten to develop into. At any rate, I promise to keep my hands off you, if that is what you want." "Not exactly," was the quiet answer. "One may draw distinctions even in that regard, but I do wish for an opportunity to discuss our quarrel without an appeal to brute force." "In other words," said Meddenham sternly, "you want to be free to say something which under ordinary conditions would earn you a thrashing. Well, say it." Marini nodded, pulled a chair round so that he was straddled across it, facing Meddenham, with his arms resting on the back. He lit a cigarette and seemed to draw inspiration from the first dense cloud of smoke, for his eyes dwelt on it rather than sought the Englishman's frown. "In a dispute of this kind," he said, "it is well to begin at the beginning, otherwise one's motives are apt to be misunderstood. Even you, I suppose, will admit that I was first in the field." There was no answer. To his credit, Meddenham thought, Marini showed a curious unwillingness to mention Cynthia's name, but, no matter what he had in mind, Meddenham certainly did not intend to render his task easier. "You see," went on Count Edouard after a thoughtful puff or two, I am quite as well born a man in my country as you are in yours. I have not ascertained the date when the Fairholme earldom was created, but there has been a Comte Marigny on the Loire since 1434. Of course you understand that I do not mention this trivial fact in any ridiculous spirit of boasting. I only put it forward as constituting a claim to a certain equality. That is all. Unfortunately, recent events in my family have robbed me of those necessary appurtenances to rank and position which a happier fate has preserved to you. I am poor. You are rich. I must marry a wife with money. You can afford to marry for love. Why then, Viscount Meddenham, should you step in and rob me of a rich wife? In spite of his loathing of the means adopted by this self-proclaimed rival to snatch an advantage, Meddenham did not hesitate to reply. My answer to that is, of course, that I have done nothing of the sort. I simply intervened between a crew of adventurers and their possible, though most improbable, victim. Unfortunately, our points of view are irreconcilable, went on the Frenchman airily. I might claim that the term adventurer, as applied to me, is a harsh one. You may inquire where and how you choose in Paris, and you will find no discredit attached to my name. But that phase of the difficulty is now of no consequence. Let us keep to the main issue. Some 3 months ago I made the acquaintance of a lady fitted in every respect to fill my ideal. I was on good terms with her father, and by no means distasteful to the lady herself. Given a fair opportunity, I thought I might win her, and I was puzzling my wits to know how best to attain that most desirable end when fate apparently opened a way. But you have no doubt observed in life that while one can seldom misinterpret fate's frowns, her smiles can be damnably misleading. Sometimes they are little else than malicious leers. It was so now, and I quickly found that I had erred badly in thinking that I had been vouchsafed a golden opportunity. "Can't you spare me some of this theorizing?" broke in Meddenham with a cold impatience. "You happened to send for me at a moment when I was exceedingly anxious to meet you. The fact that I am here in response to your request stops me from carrying out the special purpose I had in view. That can wait, though not very long. At any rate, you might save yourself some hair-splitting and me some exercise of self-restraint by telling me what it is that you want." "A thousand regrets if I am boring you," said Marigny, leaning back in the chair and laying the cigarette on the mantelpiece. "Yet bear with me a little while, I pray you, these explanations are necessary. A sane man acts with motive, and it is only reasonable that you should understand my motive before you hear my project." "Ah, then, there is a project?" "Yes. You have stepped in between me and the realization of my dearest wish, of my main object in life. You are, I take it, a soldier and a gentleman. There is a way by which men of honour settle these disputes. I invite you to follow it." The fantastic proposal was made with an air of dignity that robbed it of any inherent ludicrousness. Greatly as he despised this man, Meddenham could not wholly conceal the wonder that leaped to his eyes. "Are you suggesting that we should fight a duel?" he asked, smiling with incredulity, yet constrained to believe that Marigny was really speaking in cold blood. "Yes, oh yes, a duel, no make-believe." A curious change came into Marigny's voice at that instant. He seemed to bark each staccato phrase, a vindictive fire gleamed in his black eyes, and the olive tint showed beneath the pink and white of his skin. Meddenham laughed almost good-humouredly. "The notion is worthy of you," he said. "I might have expected it, but I fancied you were more sensible. Surely you know enough of my world to realize that such a thing is impossible." "It must be made possible," said Marigny gravely. "It cannot, I refuse." "I am partly prepared for some such answer, but I shall be just to you in my thoughts, Viscount Meddenham. I know you are a brave man. It is not cowardice, but your insular convention that restrains you from facing me on the field. Nevertheless, I insist." Meddenham threw out an impatient hand. "You are talking arrant nonsense, for what purpose I can hardly conceive," he said, frowning with vexation at the tragi-comedy into which he had been drawn. "Frenchmen, it is true, regard these things from a different standpoint. That which seems rational to you is little else than buffoonery to me. If that is your object in seeking an interview, it has now been accomplished. I absolutely decline to entertain the proposition for a moment. You have certainly succeeded in lending an air of drivel to a controversy that I regard as serious. I came here filled with very bitter thoughts toward you, but your burlesque has disarmed me. It is only fair, however, that I should warn you not to cross my path again, since one's sense of humour may become strained, and that will be bad for you." His attitude seemed to betoken an immediate departure, but Marigny looked at him so fixedly that he waited to hear what the other had to say. He was quite determined now to keep Cynthia out of the discussion. Even Van Renen's letter need not be mentioned until he had seen the millionaire in person and disabused his mind of the inept inventions with which the Frenchman had perplexed him. "I don't take your refusal as final," said Count Edouard, speaking very slowly and choosing each sentence with evident care. "I was at pains to explain my position, and there now devolves upon me the disagreeable duty of telling you what will happen if you do not fight. You English may not care to defend your honor in the manner that appeals to a more sensitive nation like the French, but you are vulnerable in your womenfolk. I now tell you quite frankly that if you do not abandon your pretensions to Miss Cynthia Van Renen, I shall make it my special business in life to ruin her socially." Meddenham listened more in amazement than indignation. At first, the true significance of the threat left him unmoved. In his ears it was a mere repetition of the bogey raised by Van Renen, and that was the wildest nonsense. "I really do not think you are responsible for your words," he began. Marigny swept aside the protest with an emphatic gesture. "Oh yes, I am," he said, his voice low, sibilant, menacing. "I have laid my plans, and shall pursue them with a complete detachment. Others may suffer, so shall I. I have practically reached the limit of my resources. In a month or less I shall be penniless. What money I could scrape together I devoted to the furtherance of this marriage project, and I am well aware that when you meet Mr. Van Renen, my poor little cobweb of intrigue will be blown into thin air. You are quite a desirable party, Viscount Meddenham. Every condition points to your speedy and happy union to the lady of your choice. It is, however, a most unfortunate and lamentable fact that she also happens to be the lady of my choice, and I shall revenge myself on you, through her, in the way best calculated to pierce your thick British hide. The future Countess of Fairholme should be superior to Caesar's wife in being not only above suspicion, but altogether removed from its taint. I'm afraid that it will be my task to tarnish her escutcheon." "You miserable rascal," cried Meddenham, stung beyond endurance by this extraordinary declaration of a vile purpose. "Why should you imagine that I shall allow you to sit there and pour forth your venom unscathed? Stand up, you beast, or must I kick you up? Ha! You are ready to fight me now, my worthy Viscount. But not in your costermonger fashion. You cannot, because I have your promise. You see, I have taken your measure with some accuracy, and hard words will not move me. I mean you to understand the issue clearly. Either you meet me under conditions that will ensure a clear field for the survivor, or I devote myself to spreading in every quarter most likely to prove damaging to Miss Van Renen the full, though perhaps untrue, but none the less fascinating story of her boating excursion on the Wye at midnight." He did then spring to his feet, for Meddenham was advancing on him with obvious intent to stifle the monstrous accusation by force. "No, no! You will achieve nothing by violence," he shouted. "You are not so much my physical superior that I cannot defend myself until assistance arrives, and I will ask you to consider what manner of gloss will be placed upon your actions if I drag you before a magistrate for an assault. Why, man, you are absolutely at my mercy. You yourself would be my best witness. Ah, touche! You felt the point that time. Que diable, I gave you credit for a quicker wit, but it is gratifying to learn that you are beginning at last to see that I am in deadly earnest. When I strike, there is nothing half-hearted behind my blow. I swear to you that I shall neither relent nor draw back. If ruin overwhelm me, Cynthia Van Renen shall be involved in my downfall. Picture to yourself the smiles, the whispers, the half-spoken scandal that will cling to her through life. Who will believe her when she says that she was ignorant of your rank when she started out from London? The incomparable Cynthia and the naughty Viscount, touring their 1,000 miles through England with Mrs. Devar as a shield of innocence. Mrs. Devar, can't you hear the long and loud guffaw that would convulse society as soon as her name cropped up? Ah, you are writhing under the lash now, I fancy. It is dawning on you that a peril greater than the sword or bullet may be near. Dozens of people in Paris and London know, or guess at any rate, that I was Cynthia Van Renen's suitor. But as many hundreds as there were, dozens shall be told that I cast her off because of the taint placed on her by your silly masquerading. You have no escape. You have no answer. Your marriage will only serve to confirm my words. Do you hear? I shall say, but you know what I shall say. Now, will you fight me? Yes, said Meddenham. A spasm of hate and furious joy struggled for mastery in Marigny's face, but he showed an iron resolution that almost equalled the coolness of the man whose scornful gaze might well have abashed him. I thought so, he said. Under terms, of course? Terms, you beast? The only terms I ask are that you shall stand before me with a sword in your hand." "A sword? Is that quite fair?" "You Englishmen are not proficient with the sword. Why not pistols?" "I think you are right," said Meddenham, turning away as if the sight of him was loathsome. "You deserve the death of a dog. It would dishonour bright steel to touch you." "We shall see," said Marigny, who, having achieved his purpose, was now apparently unconcerned as to its outcome. "But it would be folly to fight without arriving at an understanding. I shall try to kill you, and I am sure you will admit that I have striven to force you into an active reciprocity in that respect. But one might only be wounded. That is the lottery of it. So I stipulate that if fortune should favour me, and you still live, you shall agree to leave me in undisturbed possession of the field for at least 6 months after our encounter." Meddenham still refused to look at him. "I agree to no terms or conditions whatsoever," he answered. "I am meeting you solely because of the foul lie you have dared to utter against the reputation of the woman I love. If you breathe a word of it in any other ear, I shall tear your tongue out by the roots, duel or no duel." "Ah, but that is a pity," jeered the Frenchman. "Don't you see that unless you accept my offer, I shall be compelled to fall back on the sword, since it is absolutely an essential element of my probable success that you should be cleared out of my way? I have no chance against you in the matrimonial market, but I think the odds are in my favour when cold steel is the arbitrator. Now, could anyone be more frank than I in this matter? I mean either to win or lose. There must be no middle course. Unless you are willing to stand aside, if beaten, I can win only by stepping over your corpse. Why not avoid extremes?" "They may be unnecessary. You have already convinced me that your ethics are drawn from the police court, but I see now that you depend for your wit on the cheaper variety of melodrama," said Meddenham, with a quiet derision that at last brought a flush of passion to the Frenchman's face. "I fail to see the need of more words. You have asked for deeds, and you shall have them. When and where do you propose that this encounter shall take place?" "Tomorrow morning, about 4 o'clock, on the sands between Calais and Ouessant." In spite of all that had gone before, Meddenham was unprepared for this categorical answer. Were he in full possession of his faculties, he must have seen the trap into which he was being decoyed. Unhappily, Van Rennen's letter had helped to complete the lure, and he was no longer amenable to the dictates of cold reason. "That is hardly possible," he said. "I do not propose to bring myself under the law as a murderer, Monsieur Marigny. I am ready to take the consequences of a fair fight, but to secure that, certain preliminaries are indispensable." "I was sure you would meet me," said Marigny, smiling nonchalantly as he lighted the cigarette again. "I have arranged everything, even the attendance of witnesses and a doctor. We cross over to Calais by the night boat from Dover, pick up the others at the Hôtel de la Plage, at which they will arrive tonight, and drive straight to the terrain. There is no prospect of outside interference. This is not the sort of duel which either of the combatants is anxious to advertise broadcast. My friends will be discretion itself, and I need hardly express my conviction that you will not make known in England the purpose of our journey. Of course, it is open to you to bring one of your own friends, if you think fit. But my notion is that these affairs should be settled discreetly in the presence of the smallest possible number of onlookers. I shall, of course, satisfy you as to the standing of the gentlemen I have summoned from Paris. On the table there are their telegrams accepting my invitation to meet us at Calais. When you came in, I was busy putting my wretched affairs in order. At least I have given you proof of my belief in your courage. I even go so far as to say that I regret most profoundly the necessity which has driven me to use threats against a charming lady in order to wring a challenge out of you. Of course, between ourselves, I know perfectly well that there is not a word of truth in the statements I have pledged myself to make, but that defect in nowise detracts from their efficiency. Indeed, it commends them the more to the real purveyor of scandal." The door slammed behind Meddenham. A dreadful doubt assailed him that if he did not hurry away from that taunting voice, he might be tempted to forget himself. And what torture that would mean to Cynthia! He was indeed a prey to complex emotions that rendered him utterly incapable of forming a well-balanced judgment. Nothing more illogical, more ill-advised, more thoroughly unsuited to achieve its object than the proposed duel could well be mooted, yet the sheer malignity of Marigny's ruffianly device to attain his ends had impelled him to that final madness. Notions of right and wrong were topsy-turvy in his brain. He was carried along on a current of passion that overturned every barrier imposed by sense and prudence. It seemed quite reasonable to one who had often risked life and limb for his country, who, from mere love of sport, had faced many an infuriated tiger and skulking lion, that he should be justified by the eternal law in striving to rid the world of this ultra-beast. He had not scrupled to kill a poisonous snake. Why should he flinch from killing a man whose chief equipment was the poison-laden fang of slander? Happily, he could use a sword in a fashion that might surprise Marigny most woefully. If he did not succeed in killing the wretch, he would surely disable him, and the thought sent such a thrill of fierce pleasure through his veins that he resolutely closed his eyes to the lamentable results that must follow his own death. Cynthia, at least, would not suffer. That was all he cared for. No matter what happened, he did not imagine for one moment that she would marry Marigny. But that eventuality hardly troubled him at all. The Frenchman had chosen the sword, and he must abide by its stern arbitrament. "Home!" he said to Dale, finding his retainer's eye bent inquiringly on him when he reached the street. The word had a curiously detached sound in his ears. "Home!" It savoured of rank lunacy to think that within a few short hours he would be standing on foreign soil, striving desperately with naked steel to defend his own life and destroy another's. Chapter 15. The outcome. The fine weather which had endured so long gave way that night. Storm clouds swept up from the Atlantic, and England was drenched in rain when Meddenham quitted Charing Cross at 9 p.m. at the 11th hour. He determined to take Dale with him. But that belated display of wisdom arose more from the need he felt of human companionship than from any sense of the absurdity of going alone to fight a duel in a foreign land. He had given no thought during the fleeting hours to the necessity of communicating with his relatives in case he fell a victim to Marigny's rancour, so he devoted himself now to writing a brief account to the Marquis of Scarland of the causes that led up to the duel. He concluded with an entreaty that his brother-in-law should use all means within his power to close down any inquiry that might result, and pointed out that in this connection Dale would prove a valuable ally, since his testimony would make clear the fact that the contest had taken place in France, where duels are looked on with a more lenient eye than in England. It was difficult to write legibly in the fast-moving, ill-lighted train, so he completed the letter on board the steamer, but did not hand it to Dale until after Calais was reached. While the steamer was drawing up to her berth, he saw Count Edouard Marigny among the few passengers on deck. He had turned his back on the Frenchman at Charing Cross, but the imperturbable Count, noticing Dale in the half-light of dawn, believed that Meddenham had brought a fellow countryman as a witness. He strolled up and said affably, "Is this gentleman your friend?" "Yes," said Meddenham, "though not quite in the sense that you mean. He will accompany me to the hotel, and await my return there." The Frenchman was evidently mystified. He smiled, but passed no other comment. Dale, who heard what was said, now wondered more than ever what lay behind this sudden journey to France. He had already recognized Marigny as the owner of the Du Vallon, for he had seen him leaving the Metropole Hotel at Brighton not many days ago, and had the best of reasons for regarding him as Viscount Meddenham's implacable enemy. Why, then, were these two crossing the Channel in company, going together to some hotel, and leaving him, Dale, to kick his heels in the small hours of the morning till it pleased them to pick him up again? In justice to the loyal-hearted chauffeur, plunged quite unknowingly into the crisis of his life, it must be said that the notion of a duel did not even occur to his puzzled brain. Nor was he given much time for speculation. A carriage awaited the trio at the quay. They carried no luggage to entail a delay at the customs, and they drove off at a rapid pace through silent streets in a drenched downpour of rain. When they reached the Hôtel de la Plage, neither Meddenham nor the Frenchman alighted, but the former handed Dale a letter. "I may be detained in France somewhat longer than I anticipated," he said in a matter-of-fact tone. "If that is so, and you have to return to England without me, hand this letter to the Marquis of Scarland. Take great care of it, and keep it in your possession until you are positively assured that I am unable to go with you." These enigmatical instructions bothered their hearer far more than any of the strange proceedings of the night. "How shall I know, my lord, whether I am to go back with you or not?" he asked. "Oh, of course I shall make that quite clear," laughed Meddenham. "At present, all you have to do is to wait here a little while." His careless demeanour dispelled the first dim shadow of doubt that had arisen in Dale's mind. The man was no stranger on the continent, having travelled with his employer over the length and breadth of France and northern Italy. But the manner of this visit to the Hôtel de la Plage at Calais was so perplexing that he essayed another question. "When may I expect you, my lord?" he asked. Meddenham affected to consult his watch. "Within an hour," he said, "perhaps a few minutes more, At any rate, you can arrange to catch the afternoon boat. Meanwhile, make yourself comfortable." By this time, 3 men, whom he had never seen before, came out from the hotel. Apparently, they were fully prepared for the coming of the visitors from England. They greeted Count Marigny cordially and were introduced to Meddenham. Without more ado, 2 of them entered the vehicle. The third, hoisting an umbrella, climbed to the side of the driver, to whom no orders were given, and the cab rattled rapidly away over the paving stones, leaving Dale to gaze disconsolately after it. Then the vague suspicions in his mind awoke into activity. For one thing, he had heard one of the strangers alluded to as Monsieur le Docteur. For another, the newcomers carried a curious-looking parcel or case of an elongated shape that suggested unusual contents. Some trick of memory came to his aid. In an hotel at Lyons he had watched a valet packing just such an object with the remainder of his employer's luggage, and was told on inquiry that it contained foils. But why foils? At 4 o'clock in the morning? In a country where men might still requite an outrage by an appeal to the law of the jungle? Hastily drawing from his breast pocket the letter entrusted to him, he examined the superscription. It was addressed simply to the Marquis of Scarland, and must surely be a document of immense significance, or the young Viscount would not have brought him all the way from London to act as messenger rather than entrust it to the post. Each instant Dale's ideas became clearer. Each instant his heart throbbed with a deeper anxiety. At last, when the four-wheeler disappeared from sight round an angle of the rain-soaked boulevard, he yielded to impulse and ran into the hotel. French people are early risers, but the visitors to Calais that morning were astir at an hour when most of the hotel staff were still sound asleep. A night porter, however, was awaiting him at the entrance, and Dale forthwith engaged in a valiant struggle with the French language in the effort to ascertain, first, whether the man possessed a bicycle, and, secondly, whether he would lend it. The Frenchman, of course, broke into a voluble statement out of all proportion to the demand, but the production of a British sovereign seemed to interpret matters satisfactorily, because a bicycle was promptly produced from a shed in the rear of the building. Dale handed the man the sovereign, jumped on the machine, and rode off rapidly in the direction taken by the cab. He had no difficulty in turning the corner round which it had vanished, but a little farther on he erred in thinking that it had gone straight ahead, since the driver had really turned to the right again in order to keep clear of the fortifications. Dale travelled at such a pace that the first long stretch of straight road opening up before his eyes convinced him of his blunder when no cab was in sight. He raced back, dismounted at the crossing, examined the road for wheel marks, and soon was in the saddle again. He was destined to be thus bothered 3 times in all, but, taught wisdom by his initial mistake, he never passed a crossroad without searching for the recent tracks of wheels. The rain helped him wherever the roadway was macadamized, but the paved routes militaires with which Calais abounds offered difficulties that caused many minutes of delay. At last he found himself in the open country, scorching along a sandy road that traversed the low dunes lying between the town of Calais and Cape Grisnez. It was not easy to see far ahead owing to the rain and mist, and he had covered a mile or more beyond the last of the scattered villas and cottages which form the eastern suburb of the port, when he saw the elusive cab drawn up by the roadside. The horse was steaming, as though it had been driven at a great pace, and the driver stood near, smoking a cigarette and protecting himself from the persistent downpour by an umbrella. Dale soon reached the man and said breathlessly, in his slow French, "Where are the gentlemen?" The cabman, who had evidently been paid to hold his tongue, merely shrugged. Dale, breathing hard, laid a heavy hand on his shoulder, whereupon the other answered, "I don't know." This, of course, was a lie, and the fact that it was a lie alarmed Dale quite as much as any of the sinister incidents which had already befallen. For one thing, there was no house into which 5 men could have gone. On each side of the road were bleak sandhills. To the right was the sea, grey and lowering beneath a leaden-hued sky that seemed to weep above a dead earth. Here, undoubtedly, was the cab, since Dale could swear to both horse and man. Where, then, were its occupants? Having to depend upon his wits, he gave no further heed to the Frenchman, but, fancying that he saw vestiges of recent footmarks on the right, or seaward, side of the road, and dragging the bicycle with him, he climbed to the top of the nearest dune, as he believed that a view of the sands could be obtained from that point. He was right. The sea was at a greater distance than he imagined would be the case, but a wide strip of firm sand, its wet patches glistening dully in the half-light, extended to the water's edge almost from the base of the hillock on which he stood. At first, his anxious eyes strained through the haze in vain, until some circling seagulls caught his attention, and then he discerned some vague forms silhouetted against a brighter belt of the sea to the northeast. 3 of the figures were black and motionless, but 2 gave an eerie suggestion of whiteness and movement. Abandoning the bicycle and hardly realizing why he should be so perturbed, Dale ran forward. Twice he stumbled and fell amidst the stringy heath grass, but he was up again in a frenzy of haste and soon was near enough to the group of men to see that Meddenham and Marigny, bare-headed and in their shirt-sleeves, were fighting with swords. Dale's eyes were now half-blinded with perspiration, for he had ridden fast through the mud from Calais, and this final run through yielding sand and clinging sedge was exhausting to one who seldom walked as many furlongs as he had covered miles that morning. But even in his panic of distress, he fancied that his master was pressing the Frenchman severely. It was no child's play, this battle with cold steel. The slender, venomous-looking blades whirled and stabbed with a fearsome vehemence, and the sharp rasp of each riposte and parry rang out with a horrible suggestiveness in the moist air. And then, as he lumbered heavily on, Dale thought he saw something that turned him sick with terror. Almost halting, he swept a hasty hand across his eyes. Then he was sure. Meddenham, with arm extended in a feint in tierce, was bearing so heavily on his opponent's rapier that his right foot slipped and he stumbled badly. At once Marigny struck with the deadly quickness and certainty of a cobra. His weapon pierced Meddenham's breast high up on the right side. The stroke was so true and furious that the Englishman, already unbalanced, was driven onto his back on the sand. Marigny wrenched the blade free and stooped with obvious intent to plunge it again through his opponent's body. A warning shout from each of the 3 spectators withheld him. He scowled vindictively, but dared not make that second mortal thrust. These French gentlemen whom he had summoned from Paris were bound by a rigid code of honour that would infallibly have caused him to be branded as a murderer had he completed matters to his satisfaction. Nevertheless, he bent and peered closely into Meddenham's face, grey now as the sand on which he was lying. "I think it will serve," he muttered to himself. "May the devil take him, but I thought he would get the better of me." He turned away with an affectation of coolness which he was far from feeling, while the doctor knelt to examine Meddenham's injury. He saw someone running towards him, but believed it must be one of the witnesses, and his eyes fell to the stained blade in his hand. "I rather forgot myself," he began. But the excuse was stopped short by a blow on the angle of the jaw that stretched him by Meddenham's side, and apparently is lifeless. Assuredly, Dale was not versed in the punctilio of the duel, but he knew how and where to hit with a fist that was hard as one of his own spanners. He put weight and passion into that punch, and scarcely understood how effective it was until he found himself struggling in the grasp of 2 excited Frenchmen. He cursed both them and Marigny fluently, and vowed the most horrible vengeance on all 3, but soon calmed himself sufficiently to see that Count Edouard could not stir, and his perturbed wits then sought to learn the extent of his master's injury. Still he swore at Marigny. "Damn you," he cried hoarsely, "you would have stabbed him as he was lying there if these pals of yours hadn't stopped you." At last, recovering some degree of self-possession, he assisted the astounded and rather frightened Frenchman to carry Meddenham to the waiting carriage. One, who spoke English, asked him to help in rendering a like service to Marigny, but he refused with an oath, and the others dared not press him. He looked so fierce and threatening. "Is he dead?" he asked the doctor brokenly. There could be no mistaking the meaning of the words, for his red-shot eyes glared fixedly at the limp body of his master. The other shook his head, but pointed in the direction of Calais, as though to suggest that the sooner the injured man was taken to some place where his wound could be properly attended to, the better would be the faint chance of life that remained. By this time the seconds were approaching, and Marigny had seemingly recovered to a slight extent from the knockout blow which he had received so unexpectedly. The doctor, who was the only self-collected person present, pointed to the bicycle. "Hotel," he said emphatically. "Go hotel, quick." Dale was minded not to desert his master, but the anxiety in the doctor's face warned him that the request ought to be obeyed. If the spark of vitality still flickering in Meddenham's body was to be preserved, not a moment should be lost in preparing a room for his reception. Gulping down his anguish, Dale mounted and made off. At a distant bend in the road, he turned his head and looked back along that dismal heath. All 5 were packed in the cab, and the coachman was urging the unwilling horse into a trot. And what of Cynthia? The break in the weather was the one thing needed to put an abrupt end to all pretence of enjoyment, so far as the Windermere tourists were concerned. Strained relations existed from the moment Van Reenen arrived at Chester. For the first time in her life, Cynthia thought that her father was not acting with the open-eyed justice which she expected from him, and for the first time in his life Peter Van Reenen harboured an uneasy suspicion that his daughter had not been quite candid with him. It was impossible, of course, in the close intimacy of long hours spent together in a touring car, that there should not be many references to Fitzroy and the Mercury. They were inevitable as the milestones, and Van Reenen, who was just as prone as other men to look at facts through his own spectacles, failed to understand how an intelligent girl like his daughter could remain in constant association with Viscount Meddenham for 5 days, and yet not discover his identity. More than once, indeed, notwithstanding the caution exercised by the others, engaged now in a tacit conspiracy to dispel memories of a foolish entanglement from the girl's mind. The identification of Fitzroy with the young Viscount trembled on the very lip of discovery. Thus, on Friday, when they had motored to Grasmere and had gathered before lunch in the lounge of the delightfully old-fashioned Rothay Hotel, Van Reenen happened to pick up an illustrated paper containing a page of pictures of the Scarland Shorthorns. Now, being a busy man, he gave little heed to the terminological convolutions of names among the British aristocracy. He had not the slightest notion that the Marquis of Scarland's wife was Meddenham's sister, and, with the quick interest of the stock-breeder, he pointed out to Mrs. Leland an animal that resembled one of his own pedigree bulls, at present waxing fat on the Montana ranch. For the moment Mrs. Leland herself had forgotten the relationship between the two men. "I met the Marquis last year at San Remo," she said heedlessly, "anyone more unlike a British peer you could not imagine. If I remember rightly, he is a blunt, farmer-like person, but his wife is very charming. By the way, who was she?" Such a question could not pass Mrs. Devar unanswered. "Lady Betty Fitzroy," she chirped instantly. Cynthia, who was looking through the window at the square-towered little church, throned midst the sombre yews which shelter the graves of Wordsworth and his kin, caught the odd conjunction of names, Betty and Fitzroy. "Who is that you are speaking of, father?" she asked, though with a listless air that Meddenham had never seen during any minute of those 5 happy days. "The Marquis of Scarland, the man from whom I bought some cattle a few years ago," he said, trusting to the directness of the reply to carry it through unchallenged. Cynthia's brows puckered in a reflective frown. "That is odd," she murmured. "What is odd?" asked her father, while Mrs. Leland bent over the periodical to hide a smile of embarrassment. "Oh, just a curious way of running in grooves people have in this country. They call towns after men, and men after towns." She was about to add that Fitzroy had told her of a sister Betty who was married to a man named Scarland, a breeder of pedigree stock, but checked the impulse. For some reason known best to her father, he did not seem to wish any mention to be made of the vanished chauffeur, but she did not gauge the true extent of his readiness to drop the subject on that occasion. Mrs. Leland looked up, caught his eye with a smile, and asked how many miles it was to Thirlmere. Cynthia's thoughts brooded again on poets and lonely graves, and the danger passed. Mrs. Devar, in these days, had recovered her complacency. The letter she wrote from Simmons' yacht had reached Van Reenen from Paris, and its hearty disapproval of Fitzroy helped to re-establish his good opinion of her. She heard constantly, too, from Marigny and her son. Both agreed that the comet-like flight of Meddenham across their horizon was rapidly losing its significance. Still, she was not quite happy. Mrs. Leland's advent had thrust her into the background, for the American widow was rich, good-looking and cultured, and the flow of small talk between the newcomer and Cynthia left her as hopelessly out of range as used to be the case when that domineering Meddenham would lean back in the car and say things beyond her comprehension, or murmur them to Cynthia if she happened to be sitting by his side. Luncheon had ended, but the clouds which had been gathering over the lake country during the morning suddenly poured a deluge over a thirsty land. Thirlmere and Ullswater and the rest of the glories of Westmoreland that lay beyond the pass of Dunmail Raise were swallowed up in a fog of rain. Simmons, questioned by the millionaire, admitted that a weather-beaten native had prophesied a week of it, more or less. 4 Britons might have sat down and played bridge stolidly, but 3 of this quartet were Americans, and within 2 hours of the change in the elements they were seated in the London-bound train at Windermere Station. Not one of them was really displeased because of this rapid alteration in their plans. Cynthia was ill at ease. Mrs. Leland wished to rejoin her guests at Trouville. Van Reenen, who was anxious to complete certain business negotiations in Paris, believed that a complete change of scene and new interest in life would speedily bring Cynthia back to her own cheery self, while Mrs. Devar, though the abandonment of the tour meant reversion to a cheap boarding-house, was not sorry that it had come to an end. In London, she would be more in her element, and, at any rate, she was beginning to feel cramped through sitting 3 in a row in Simmons' car after the luxurious comfort of 2 in the tonneau of the Mercury. So it came to pass that on Friday evening, while Meddenham was driving from Cavendish Square to Charing Cross, Cynthia was crossing London on a converging line from St Pancras to the Savoy Hotel. Strange, indeed, was the play of fate's shuttle that it should have so nearly reunited the unseen threads of their destinies. Again, a trifling circumstance conspired to detain Van Rennen in London. One of his business associates in Paris, rendered impatient by the failure of the great man to return as quickly as he had promised, arrived in England by the afternoon service from the Gare du Nord and was actually standing in the foyer of the hotel when Van Rennen entered with the others. As a result of this meeting, the journey to Paris arranged for Saturday was postponed till Sunday, and on this trivial base was destined to be built a very remarkable edifice. It chanced that Mrs. Leland, too, decided to have a day in London, and she and Cynthia went out early. They returned to lunch at the hotel, and the girl, pleading lack of appetite, slipped out alone to buy a copy of Milton's poems. From the bookseller's, she wandered into the Embankment Gardens. She was a dutiful daughter, and had resolved to obey without question her father's stern command not to enter again into communication with a man of whom he so strongly disapproved. But she was not content for all that, and the dripping trees and rain-sodden flowers seemed now to accord with her distraught mood. The fine, though not bright, interval that had tempted her forth soon gave way to another shower, and she ran for shelter into the Charing Cross station of the Metropolitan Railway. She stood in one of the doorways looking out disconsolately over the river, when a taxicab drove up and deposited its occupant at the station. Then some unbidden impulse led her to hail the driver. "Take me to Cavendish Square," she said. "What number, miss?" he asked. "No number. Just drive slowly round the square and return to the Savoy Hotel." He eyed her curiously, but made no comment. Soon she was speeding up Regent Street, bent on gratifying the truly curious whim of seeing what manner of residence it was that Fitzroy occupied in London. Fate had failed in her weaving during the previous evening, but on the present occasion she combined warp and weft without any error. The cab was crawling past the Fairholme mansion, and Cynthia's astonished eyes were regarding its style and general air of magnificence with some degree of heart sinking. For it did then seem to be true that Mrs. Duvar's original estimate of Fitzroy was correct, when a man sprang out of another taxi in front of the door and glanced at her while in the very act of running up the steps. Recognition was mutual. Dale muttered under his breath a wholly unjustifiable assumption as to his future state, halted dubiously, and then signalled to Cynthia's driver to stop. He strode towards her across the road and thrust his head through the open window. "Of course, miss," he said roughly. "You don't know what has happened?" "No," she said, too greatly surprised to resent his strange manner. "Well," he growled, "somebody's been nearly killed on your account, that's all." "Somebody," she repeated, and her lips went white. "Yes, you ought to guess well enough who it is. He and that rotten Frenchman fought a duel this morning on the sands near Calais, and Marini as good as murdered him." Dale's heart was sore against her as the cause of his master's plight, but even in his own distress he was quick to see the shrinking terror in the girl's eyes. "Are you speaking of Mr. Fitzroy?" she demanded. "Are you telling the truth? Oh, for heaven's sake, man, tell me what you mean." "I mean what I say, miss," said he more softly. "I have left him almost at death's door in an hotel at Calais." "That damned Frenchman." "I beg your pardon, miss, but I can't contain myself when I think of him. Ran a sword through him this morning, and would have killed him outright if he hadn't been stopped by some other gentleman. And now, there he is, lying in the hotel, with a doctor and a nurse trying to coax the life back into him, while I had to scurry back here to tell his people." Some women might have shrieked and fainted, not so Cynthia. At that instant there was one thing to be done, and one only. She saw the open road, and took it without faltering or thought as to the future. "When is the next train to Calais?" she asked. "At 9 o'clock tonight, miss." "Oh, God!" she wailed under her breath. Dale's voice grew even more sympathetic. "Was you a-thinking of going to him, miss?" he asked. "Would that I could fly there," she moaned. He scratched the back of his ear, for it was by such means that Dale sought inspiration. "Dash it all," he cried, "I wish I had seen you half an hour earlier. There is a train that leaves Charing Cross at 20 minutes past 2. It goes by way of Folkestone and Boulogne, and from Boulogne one can get easy to Calais. Anyhow, what's the use of talking? It is too late." Cynthia glanced at her watch. It was just 25 minutes to 3. "How far is Folkestone?" was the immediate demand generated by her practical American brain. 72 miles, said the chauffeur, who knew his roads out of London. And what time does the boat leave? A light irradiated his face, and he swore volubly. We can do it, he shouted. By the Lord, we can do it. Are you game? Game? The light that leaped to her eyes was sufficient answer. He tore open the door of the cab, roaring to the driver, round that corner to the right, quick, then into the mews at the back. Within 2 minutes the Mercury was attracting the attention of the police as it whirled through the traffic towards Westminster Bridge. Dale's face was set like a block of granite. He had risked a good deal in leaving his master at the point of death at Calais. He was now risking more, far more, in rushing back to Calais again without having discharged the duty which had dragged him from that master's bedside. But he thought he had secured the best physician London could bring to the sufferer's aid, and the belief sustained him in an action that was almost heroic. He was a simple-minded fellow, with a marked taste for speed in both animals and machinery, but he had hit on one well-defined trait in human nature when he decided that if a man is dying for the sake of a woman, the presence of that woman may cure when all else will fail. Chapter 16. THENDOFONE tour, TH beginning OF another. Cynthia found him lying in a darkened room. The nurse had just raised some of the blinds. A dismal day was drawing to its close, and more light was needed ere she could distinguish marked bottles and doses and the rest of the appurtenances of dangerous illness. An English nurse would have forbidden the presence of a stranger. This French one acted with more discretion if less of strict science. "Madam is his sister, perhaps," she whispered. "No." "A relative, then?" "No, a woman who loves him." That heartbroken admission told the whole tale to the quick-witted Frenchwoman. There had been a duel. One man was seriously injured. The other, she had heard, was also receiving medical attention in another hotel. The Témoins, wistful to avoid the interrogation of the law, had so arranged. And here was the woman who had caused the quarrel. Well, such was the will of Providence. These things had been since man and woman were expelled from paradise, for the nurse, though a devout Catholic, suspected that Genesis had suppressed certain details of the first fratricide, and would continue, she supposed, until the millennium. She nodded cheerfully. There is every reason to hope, but he must not be disturbed, not excited, that is, she added, seeing the wan agony in Cynthia's face. The girl tiptoed to the side of the bed. Meddenham's eyes were closed, but he was muttering something. She bent and kissed his forehead, and a strange smile broke through the tense lines of pain. Even in his semi-conscious state he felt the touch of those exquisite lips. "My Lady Alice," he said. She choked back a sob. He was dreaming of Comus, standing with her in the ruined banqueting hall of Ludlow Castle. "Yes, your Lady Alice," she breathed. A slight quiver shook him. "Don't tell Cynthia," he said brokenly. "She must never know." "Ah, if I hadn't slipped, I would have quieted his viperish tongue. But Cynthia must not know." "Oh, my dear, Cynthia does know." "It is you who know not. Kind heaven, let him live. Grant that I may tell him all that I know." She could not help it. The words welled forth of their own accord, but the nurse touched her arm gently. "It is a little fever," she whispered with ready sympathy. "Soon it will pass. He will sleep, and when he awakes, it is perhaps permissible that you should speak to him." Well, it was permissible. The age of miracles had not passed for those two. Even the experienced doctor marvelled at the strength of a man who at 4 o'clock in the morning could have a sword driven through the tissues in perilous proximity to the right lung, and yet, at 9 o'clock on that same night, was able to announce an unalterable resolution to get up and dress for breakfast next day. That, of course, was a pleasing fiction intended for Cynthia's benefit. It served its purpose admirably. The kindly nurse displayed an unexpected firmness in leading her to her own room, there to eat and sleep. For Cynthia had an ordeal to face. Many things had been said in the car during that mad rush to Folkestone, and on board the steamer which ferried Dale and herself to Boulogne she had wrung from the taciturn chauffeur a full, true and particular account of Meddenham, his family, and his doings throughout as much of his life as Dale either knew or guessed. By the time they reached Boulogne she had made up her mind with a characteristic decision. One long telegram to her father, another to Lord Fairholme, caused heartburning and dismay, not alone in certain apartments of the Savoy Hotel, but in the aristocratic aloofness of Cavendish Square and Curzon Street. As a result, 2 elderly men, a younger one, in the person of the Marquis of Scarland, and 2 tearful women, Lady St. Maur and Mrs. Leland, met at Charing Cross about 1 o'clock in the morning to travel by special train and steamer. Another woman telegraphed from Shropshire saying that baby was better and that she would follow by the first steamer on Sunday. Mrs. Devar did not await developments. She fled, dinnerless, to some borough in Bayswater. These alarums and excursions were accompanied by the ringing of telephones and the flight of carriages back and forth through muddy London, and Cynthia was called on to deal with a whole sheaf of telegrams which demanded replies either to Dover or to Scarland Towers in Shropshire. With a man like Van Reenen at one end, however, and a woman like his daughter at the other, it might be fairly assumed that even the most complex skein of circumstances might be resolved from its tangle. As a matter of curious coincidence, the vessel which carried Marigny to England passed in mid-channel, its sister ship conveying the grief-stricken party of relatives to France. It happened, too, that the clouds from the Atlantic elected to hover over Britain rather than France, and when Cynthia stood on the quay to meet the incoming steamer, a burst of sunshine from the east gave promise of a fine, if somewhat blustery day. 5 pairs of eyes sought her face anxiously, while the vessel was warping to the quay opposite the Gare Maritime. They looked there for tidings, and they were not disappointed. "That's all right," said Van Reenen, with an unwanted huskiness in his voice. Cynthia wouldn't smile if she hadn't good news. "Thank God for that," muttered the Earl, bending his head to examine a landing ticket, the clear type of which he was utterly unable to read. "I never thought for a minute that any Frenchman could kill George," cried Scarland cheerfully. But the 2 women said nothing, could see nothing, and the white-faced but smiling Cynthia, standing near the shoreward end of the gangway, had vanished in a sudden mist. Of course, Marigny was right when he foresaw that Van Reenen could not meet either Meddenham or any of his relatives for 5 minutes without his poor little cobweb of intrigue being dissipated once and forever. With the marvellous insight that every woman possesses when dealing with the affairs of the man she loves, Cynthia combined the eloquence of an orator with the practised skill of a clever lawyer in revealing each turn and twist of the toils which had enveloped her since that day in Paris, when her father happened to suggest in Marigny's hearing that she might utilize his hired car for a tour in England, while he concluded the business that was detaining him in the French capital. Nothing escaped her. She unravelled every knot, Meddenham's few broken words, supplemented by the letter to his brother-in-law which he told her to obtain from Dale, threw light on all the dark places. The bloom had fled. It was a keenly interested, almost light-hearted little party that walked through the sunshine to the Hôtel de la Plage. Dale, abashed, sheepish, yet oddly confident that all was for the best in a queer world, met the Earl of Fairholme later in the day. His lordship, who had been pining for someone to pitch into, addressed him sternly. "This is a nice game you've been playing," he said. "I always thought you were a man of steady habits, a little given to horse racing perhaps, but otherwise a decent member of the community." "So I was before I met Viscount Meddenham, my lord," was the daring answer. For Dale was no fool, and he had long since seen how certain apparently hostile forces had adapted themselves to new conditions. "Before you left him, you mean?" growled the Earl. "What sort of sense was there in letting him fight a duel? It could have been stopped in 50 different ways." "Yes, my lord, but I never suspicioned a word of it till he went off in the cab with them." The Earl held up a warning finger. "Hush," he said. "This is France, remember, and you are the foreigner here. Where is my son's car?" "In the garage at Folkestone, my lord." "Well, you had better cross by an early boat tomorrow and bring it here. You understand all the preliminaries, I suppose. Find out from the customs people what deposit is necessary, and come to me for the money." So it happened that when Meddenham was able to take his first drive in the open air, the Mercury awaited him and Cynthia at the door of the hotel. It positively sparkled in the sunlight. Never was car more spick and span. The brasswork scintillated, each cylinder was rhythmical, and a microscope would not have revealed one speck of dust on body or upholstery. On a day in July, for everybody agreed that not even a marriage should be allowed to interfere with the Scottish festival of St. Grouse. That same shining Mercury, with the tonneau decorously cased in glass for the hour, drew up at the edge of a red carpet laid down from curve to stately porch of St. George's, Hanover Square. And Dale turned a grinning face to the doorway when Viscount Meddenham led his bride down the steps through a shower of rice and good wishes. Wedding breakfasts and receptions are all much of a muchness, as the Mad Hatter said to another Alice, and it was not until the Mercury was speeding north by west to Scarland Towers, lent to the happy pair for the honeymoon, while Betty took the children to recuperate at the seaside, that Cynthia felt she was really married. "I have a bit of news for you," said her husband, taking a letter from his pocket. "I received a letter by this morning's post. A heap of others remain unopened till you and I have time to go through them, but this one caught my attention, and I read it while I was dressing." He had an excellent excuse for putting his arm round her waist while he held the open sheet so that both might peruse it at the same time. It ran, "M.Y. Dear Viscount. Of course I meant to kill you, but fate decided otherwise." Indeed, with my usual candour, which by this time you may have learned to admire, I may add that only the special kind of dog's luck, which attaches itself to members of my family, saved me from being killed by you. But that is ancient history now. I am glad to hear that your wound was not really serious. There was no sense in merely crippling you. My only chance lay in procuring your untimely demise. Having failed, however, I want to tell you, with the utmost sincerity, that I never had the slightest intention of carrying out my abominable threat in regard to the fair lady who is now Viscountess Meddenham. Were you other than a heavy-witted and thick-skinned Briton, you would have known that I was goading you into issuing a challenge. This piece of information is my wedding present. It is all I can give, because metaphorically speaking, I haven't a sow. I am, as you see, domiciled in Brussels, where my car is attached by an unsympathetic hotel proprietor. Still, I am devoid of rancour, and mean to keep a sharp eye for a well-favoured and well-dowered wife, such a one, in fact, as you managed to snap up under my very nose. With 1,000 compliments, I am, yours very sincerely, Edward Marigny. P.S. Duval went steerage to the United States when he heard of our affair. He thought it was all up with you, and with him. The wretch, murmured Cynthia. Can he really believe even yet that I would have married him? I don't care twopence what he believes, said Meddenham, giving her a reassuring hug. Indeed, I have a mind to write and ask him how much he owes in that hotel. Don't you see, my dear, that if it hadn't been for Marigny there was a chance that I might have left you at Bristol? Never, cooed Cynthia. Well, now I have got you, I am beginning to imagine all sorts of terrible possibilities which might have parted us. I remember thinking, when my foot slipped. Oh, don't, she murmured. I can't bear to hear of that. Sometimes, in Calais, I awoke screaming, and then I knew I had seen it in my dreams. There you have disarranged my hat, but I don't think much of your budget, anyhow. Mine is a great deal more to the point. My father told me this morning that he is sure he will feel very lonely now. He never meant, he said, to put anyone in my dear mother's place, but he will miss me so greatly that perhaps Mrs. Leland. By Jove, cried Meddenham, that will be splendid. I like Mrs. Leland. At one time, do you know, I rather fancied she might become my stepmother. Now it seems I shall have to greet her as a mother-in-law. She was bound to come into the family one way or another. When is it to be? Cynthia laughed delightedly. Father looked so confused when I asked him. Say, wouldn't it be a joke if Simmons brought them to Scarland Towers one day and they were announced by some solemn footman as Mr. and Mrs. Van Reenen? Cynthia, you know, he teased her. I don't know, but I am a good guesser, she said, and she was. Theend. A FEWOF Grosset and Dunlap's great books at little prices, Quincy Adams Sawyer. A picture of New England home life, with illustrations by C.W. Reed and scenes reproduced from the play. One of the best New England stories ever written. It is full of homely human interest. There is a wealth of New England village character, scenes and incidents, forcibly, vividly and truthfully drawn. Few books have enjoyed a greater sale and popularity. Dramatized, it made the greatest rural play of recent times. The Further Adventures, O.F. Quincy Adams Sawyer, by Charles Felton Pidgeon, illustrated by Henry Roth. All who love honest sentiment, quaint and sunny humour, and homespun philosophy will find these Further Adventures a book after their own heart. HALF A Chance, by Frederick S. Isham, illustrated by Herman Pfeiffer. The thrill of excitement will keep the reader in a state of suspense, and he will become personally concerned from the start as to the central character, a very real man who suffers, dares, and achieves. Virginia O.F.Thair Lanes, by Herbert Quick, illustrated by William R. Lay. The author has seized the romantic moment for the airship novel and created the pretty story of a lover and his lass contending with an elderly relative for the monopoly of the skies. An exciting tale of adventure in midair. Game ANDTH Candle, by Eleanor M. Ingram. illustrated by P.D. Johnson. The hero is a young American who, to save his family from poverty, deliberately commits a felony. Men follow his capture and imprisonment and his rescue by a Russian Grand Duke. A stirring story, rich in sentiment. The Music Master, by Charles Klein, illustrated by John Ray. This marvelously vivid narrative turns upon the search of a German musician in New York for his little daughter. Mr. Klein has well portrayed his pathetic struggle with poverty, his varied experiences in endeavouring to meet the demands of a public not trained to an appreciation of the classic, and his final great hour when, in the rapidly shifting events of a big city, his little daughter, now a beautiful young woman, is brought to his very door. A superb bit of fiction, palpitating with the life of the great metropolis. The play in which David Warfield scored his highest success. Dr. Lavendar's People, by Margaret Deland, illustrated by Lucius Hitchcock. Mrs. Deland won so many friends through Old Chester tales that this volume needs no introduction beyond its title. The lovable doctor is more ripened in this later book, and the simple comedies and tragedies of the old village are told with dramatic charm. Old Chester Tales, by Margaret Deland, illustrated by Howard Pyle. Stories portraying with delightful humour and pathos a quaint people in a sleepy old town. Dr. Lavendar, a very human and lovable preacher, is the connecting link between these dramatic stories from life. Heffelin, Love Wis, Wife, by E.P. Rowe, with frontispiece. The hero is a farmer, a man with honest, sincere views of life. Bereft of his wife, his home is cared for by a succession of domestics of varying degrees of inefficiency until, from a most unpromising source, comes a young woman who not only becomes his wife, but commands his respect and eventually wins his love. A bright and delicate romance, revealing on both sides a love that surmounts all difficulties and survives the censure of friends as well as the bitterness of enemies. Yoke, by Elizabeth Miller. Against the historical background of the days when the children of Israel were delivered from the bondage of Egypt, the author has sketched a romance of compelling charm. A biblical novel as great as any since Ben-Hur, Saul of Tarsus, by Elizabeth Miller, illustrated by André Castaigne. The scenes of this story are laid in Jerusalem, Alexandria, Rome, and Damascus. And the Apostle Paul, the martyr Stephen, Herod Agrippa, and the emperors Tiberius and Caligula are among the mighty figures that move through the pages. Wonderful descriptions and a love story of the purest and noblest type mark this most remarkable religious romance. M.A. Nem Marries, by Mary Roberts Reinhardt, illustrated by Harrison Fisher and Mayo Bunker. A young artist whose wife had recently divorced him finds that a visit is due from his Aunt Selina, an elderly lady having ideas about things quite apart from the bohemian set in which her nephew is a shining light. The way in which matters are temporarily adjusted forms the motif of the story. A farcical extravaganza, dramatized under the title of 7 Days. Fashionable Adventures, O.F. Joshua Craig, by David Graham Phillips, illustrated. A young Westerner, uncouth and unconventional, appears in political and social life in Washington. He attains power in politics, and a young woman of the exclusive set becomes his wife, undertaking his education in social amenities. D.O.C. Gordon, by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman, illustrated by Frank T. Merrill. Against the familiar background of American town life, the author portrays a group of people strangely involved in a mystery. Doc. Gordon, the one physician of the place, Dr. Elliot, his assistant, a beautiful woman, and her altogether charming daughter are all involved in the plot. A novel, a great interest. Holy Orders, by Marie Corelli. A dramatic story in which is pictured a clergyman in touch with society, people, stage favourites, simple village folk, powerful financiers and others, each presenting vital problems to this man in holy orders, problems that we are now struggling with in America. Catherine, by Eleanor Macartney Lane, with frontispiece. Catherine, the heroine of this story, is a lovely Irish girl of lowly birth, but gifted with a beautiful voice. The narrative is based on the facts of an actual singer's career, and the viewpoint throughout is a most exalted one. Fortunes, O.F. Fifi, by Molly Elliott Sewell, illustrated by Tida Thulstrup. a story of life in France at the time of the First Napoleon. Fifi, a glad, mad little actress of 18, is the star performer in a third-rate Parisian theatre. A story as dainty as a Watteau painting. SHHH Hesitates, by Harris Dixon. Illustrated by C.W. Relier. The scene of this dashing romance shifts from Dresden to St. Petersburg in the reign of Peter the Great, and then to New Orleans. The hero is a French soldier of fortune, and the princess who hesitates. But you must read the story to know how she that hesitates may be lost and yet saved. Happy Hawkins, by Robert Alexander Wasson. Illustrated by Howard Giles, a ranch and cowboy novel. Happy Hawkins tells his own story with such a fine capacity for knowing how to do it, and with so much humour that the reader's interest is held in surprise, then admiration, and at last in positive affection. Comrades, by Thomas Dixon, Jr., illustrated by C.D. Williams. The locale of this story is in California, where a few socialists establish a little community. The author leads the little band along the path of disillusionment and gives some brilliant flashes of light on one side of an important question. Tono Bungay, by Herbert George Wells. The hero of this novel is a young man who, through hard work, earns a scholarship and goes to London. Written with a frankness verging on Rousseau's, Mr. Wells still uses rare discrimination, and the borderline of propriety is never crossed. An entertaining book with both a story and a moral, and without a dull page, Mr. Wells' most notable achievement. A Husband by Proxy, by Jack Steele. A young criminologist, but recently arrived in New York City, is drawn into a mystery, partly through financial need and partly through his interest in a beautiful woman, who seems at times the simplest child and again a perfect mistress of intrigue. A baffling detective story. Like Another Helen, by George Horton. Illustrated by C.M. Relier. Mr. Horton's powerful romance stands in a new field and brings an almost unknown world in reality before the reader, the world of conflict between Greek and Turk on the island of Crete. The Helen of the story is a Greek, beautiful, desolate, defiant, pure as snow. There is a certain new force about the story, a kind of master craftsmanship and mental dominance that holds the reader. The Master O.F. Appleby, by Francis Lindy. Illustrated by T. de Thulstrup. A novel tale concerning itself in part with the great struggle in the two Carolinas, but chiefly with the adventures therein of two gentlemen who loved one and the same lady. A strong, masculine, and persuasive story. A modern Madonna. By Caroline Abbott Stanley. A story of American life, founded on facts as they existed some years ago in the District of Columbia. The theme is the maternal love and splendid courage of a woman. The novels, O.F. George B. A. R. McCutcheon Graustark. A story of love behind a throne, telling how a young American met a lovely girl and followed her to a new and strange country. A thrilling, dashing narrative. Beverly O.F. Graustark. Beverly is a bewitching American girl who has gone to that stirring little principality, Graustark, to visit her friend the princess, and there has a romantic affair of her own. Brewster's Millions. A young man is required to spend $1 million in 1 year in order to inherit 7. How he does it forms the basis of a lively story. Castle Craneacrow. The story revolves round the abduction of a young American woman, her imprisonment in an old castle, and the adventures created through her rescue. Cowardice Court. An amusing social feud in the Adirondacks, in which an English girl is tempted into being a traitor by a romantic young American, forms the plot. Daughter O.F. Anderson, C.R.O.W. The story centres about the adopted daughter of the town marshal in a western village. Her parentage is shrouded in mystery, and the story concerns the secret that deviously works to the surface. Themanmfrom Brodneys. The hero meets a princess in a faraway island among fanatically hostile Mussulmen. Romantic lovemaking amid amusing situations and exciting adventures. Nidra. A young couple elope from Chicago to go to London, travelling as brother and sister. They are shipwrecked, and a strange mix-up occurs on account of it. T.H.E. Sherrod's. The scene is the Middle West and centres around a man who leads a double life, a most enthralling novel. Truxton, King. A handsome, good-natured young fellow ranges on the earth looking for romantic adventures and is finally enmeshed in most complicated intrigues in Graustark. Kate Douglas Wiggins' stories OF pure delight, full of originality and humour, kindliness and cheer. HEOLD, Peabody, PEW, large octavo. Decorative text pages printed in 2 colours. Illustrations by Alice Barber Stevens. One of the prettiest romances that has ever come from this author's pen is made to bloom on Christmas Eve in the sweet freshness of an old New England meeting house. Penelope's Progress, attractive cover design in colours. Scotland is the background for the merry doings of 3 very clever and original American girls. Their adventures in adjusting themselves to the Scot and his land are full of humour. Penelope's Irish experiences uniform in style with Penelope's Progress. The trio of clever girls who rambled over Scotland cross the border to the Emerald Isle, and again they sharpen their wits against new conditions and revel in the land of laughter and wit. Rebecca of Sunnybrook, FRM, one of the most beautiful studies of childhood. Rebecca's artistic, unusual, and quaintly charming qualities stand out midst a circle of austere New Englanders. The stage version is making a phenomenal dramatic record. NEW Chronicles OF Rebecca, with illustrations by F.C. Yon. Some more quaintly amusing chronicles that carry Rebecca through various stages to her 18th birthday. Rose OTHE River, with illustrations by George Wright. The simple story of Rose, a country girl, and Stephen, a sturdy young farmer. The girl's fancy for a city man interrupts their love and merges the story into an emotional strain where the reader follows the events with rapt attention. Grosset and Dunlap, 526, WEST 26th, STN, EWYORK, Transcriber's Note, 1. Minor changes have been made to correct typesetter's errors, otherwise, every effort has been made to remain true to the author's words and intent. 2. In the advertising pages, book titles that were underlined have been indicated by an equal sign, preceding and following the underlined text.